Ants keeps on rubbing his knees. His overalls are faded. On one knee a serge patch cut out of a pair of Sunday pants wore iron slick. No man mislikes it more than me, he says. A fellow's got to guess ahead now and then, I say, but come long and short, it won't be no harm done neither way. She ought to get started right off, he says. It's far enough to Jefferson at best, but the road is good now, I say. It's fixing to rain tonight, too. His folks buried at New Hope, too, not 3 miles away. But it's just like him to marry a woman born a day's hard ride away and have her die on him. He looks out over the land, rubbing his knees. No man so mislikes it, he says. They'll get back in plenty of time, I say. I wouldn't worry none. It means $3, he says. Might be it won't be no need for them to rush back no way, I says. I hope it. She's a-going, he says. Her mind is set on it. It's a hard life on women for a fact. Some women. I mind my mammy lived to be 70 and more. Worked every day, rain or shine. Never a sick day since her last chap was born, until one day she kind of looked around her. And then she went and taken that lace-trimmed nightgown she had had for 45 years and never wore out of the chest, and put it on and lay down on the bed and pulled the covers up and shut her eyes. You all will have to look out for Pa the best you can, she said. I'm tired. Ants rubbed his hand on his knees. The Lord giveth, he says. We can hear Cash a-hammering and a-sawing beyond the corner. It's true. Never a truer breath was ever breathed. The Lord giveth, I say. That boy comes up the hill. He is carrying a fish nigh as long as he is. He slings it to the ground and grunts hard and spits over his shoulder just like a man, done nigh as long as he is. What's that, I say, a hog? Where did you get it? Down to the bridge, he says. He turns it over, the underside caked over with dust where it's wet. The eye coated over, humped under the dirt. Are you aiming to leave it laying there? Ant says. I aim to show it tomorrow, Vardaman says. He looks toward the door. We can hear the talking coming on the draft. Cash, too, knocking and hammering at the boards. There's company in there, he says. Just my folks, I say. They'd enjoy to see it, too. He says nothing, watching the door. Then he looks down at the fish laying in the dust. He turns it over with his foot and prods at the eye bump with his toe, gouging at it. Ants is looking out over the land. Vardaman looks at Ants's face, then at the door. He turns, going toward the corner of the house, when Ants called him without looking around. You clean that fish, Ants says. Vardaman stops. Why can't you or Dell clean it, he says. You clean that fish, Ants says. Oh, Paul, Vardaman says. You clean it, Ants says. He don't look around. Vardaman comes back and picks up the fish. It slides out of his hand, smearing wet dirt onto him, and flops down, dirtying itself again, gap-mouthed, goggle-eyed, hiding into the dust like it was ashamed of being dead, like it was in a hurry to get back hid again. Vardaman cusses it. He cusses it like a grown man standing astraddle of it. Ants don't look around. Vardaman picks it up again. He goes on around the house, toting it in both arms like an armful of wood, it overlapping him at both ends, head and tail, darn nigh big as he is. Ant's wrists dangle out of his sleeves. I never seen him with a shirt on that looked like it was his in all my life. They all look like Jewel might have give him his old ones. Not Jewel, though. He's long-armed, even if he is spending. Except for the lack of sweat. You could tell there ain't been nobody else's but Ant's that way without no mistake. His eyes look like pieces of burnt-out cinder fixed in his face, looking out over the land. When the shadow touches the steps, he says, it's 5 o'clock. Just as I get up, Cora comes to the door and says it's time to go on. Ants reaches for his shoes. Now, Mr. Bundren, Cora says, don't you get up now. He puts his shoes on, stomping into them, like he does everything, like he is hoping all the time he really can't do it and can quit trying to. When we go up the hall, we can hear them clumping on the floor like they was iron shoes. He comes toward the door where she is, blinking his eyes, kind of looking ahead of himself before he sees, like he is hoping to find her setting up in a chair maybe, or maybe sweeping, and looks into the door in that surprised way like he looks in and finds her still in bed every time, and Dewey Dell still a-fanning her with the fan. He stands there like he don't aim to move again nor nothing else. Well, I reckon we better get on, Cora says. I got to feed the chickens. It's fixing to rain, too. Clouds don't lie. The cotton making every day and the Lord sends. That'll be something else for him. Cash is still trimming at the boards. If there's anything we can do, Cora says, Ants will let us know, I say. Ants don't look at us. He looks around, blinking in that surprised way, like he had wore himself down, being surprised, and was even surprised at that. If Cash just works that careful on my barn. I told Ants it likely won't be no need, I say. I so hope it. Her mind is set on it, he says. I reckon she's bound to go. Comes to all of us, Cora says. Let the Lord comfort you. About that corn, I say. I tell him again I will help him if he gets into a tight, with her sick and all. Like most folks around here, I done hope him so much already I can't quit now. I aim to get to it today, he says. Seems like I can't get my mind on nothing. Maybe she'll hold out till you're laid by, I say. If God wills it, he says, let him comfort you, Cora says. If Cash just works that careful on my barn, he looks up as we pass. Don't reckon I'll get to you this week, he says. Tain't no rush, I say, whenever you get around to it. We get into the wagon. Cora sets the cake box on her lap. It's fixing to rain show. I don't know what he'll do, Cora says. I just don't know. Poor Aunt, I say. She kept him at work for 30-odd years. I reckon she is tired. And I reckon she'll be behind him for 30 years more, Kate says. Or if it ain't her, he'll get another one before cotton picking. I reckon Cash and Doll can get married now, Eula says. That poor boy, Cora says, that poor little tyke. What about Jewel, Kate says. He can too, Eula says. Huh, Kate says. I reckon he will. I reckon so. I reckon there's more gals than one around here that don't want to see Jewel tied down. Well, they don't need to worry. Why, Kate, Cora says. The wagon begins to rattle. The poor little tyke, Cora says. It's fixing to rain this night. Yes, sir. A rattling wagon is mighty dry weather for a bird cell. But that'll be cured. It will for a fact. She ought to take them cakes after she said she would, Kate says. Paul stands beside the bed. From behind his leg, Vardaman peers, with his round head and his eyes round, and his mouth beginning to open. She looks at Paul. All her failing life appears to drain into her eyes, urgent, irremediable. It's Jewel she wants, Dewdell says. Why, Addie, Paul says, him and Doll went to make one more load. They thought there was time, that you would wait for them, and that $3 and all. He stoops, laying his hand on hers. For a while yet she looks at him without reproach, without anything at all, as if her eyes alone to listen to the irrevocable cessation of his voice. Then she raises herself, who has not moved in 10 days. Dewdell leans down, trying to press her back. Ma, she says, Ma. She is looking out the window, at Cash stooping steadily at the board in the fading light, laboring on toward darkness and into it, as though the stroking of the saw illumined its own motion, board and saw engendered. You, Cash, she shouts, her voice harsh, strong and unimpaired. You, Cash. He looks up at the gaunt face framed by the window in the twilight. It is a composite picture of all time since he was a child. He drops the saw and lifts the board for her to see, watching the window in which her face has not moved. He drags a second plank into position and slants the two of them into their final juxtaposition, gesturing toward the one jet on the ground, shaping with his empty hand in pantomime the finished box. For a while she still looks down at him from the composite picture, neither with censure nor approbation. Then the face disappears. She lies back and turns her head without so much as glancing at Paul. She looks at Vardaman, her eyes, the life in them rushing suddenly upon them. The two flames glare up for a steady instant, then they go out as though someone had lain down and blown upon them. Ma, Dewdell says, Ma, leaning above the bed, her hands lifted a little, the fan still moving like it was for 10 days, she begins to keen. Her voice is strong, young, tremulous and clear, wrapped with its own timbre and volume, the fan still moving steadily up and down, whispering the useless air. Then she flings herself across Addie Bunbury's knees, clutching her, shaking her with the furious strength of the young, before sprawling suddenly across the handful of rotten bones that Addie Bunbury left, jarring the whole bed into a chattering sibilant of mattress shucks. Her arms outflung and the fan in one hand still, beating with expiring breath into the quilt. From behind Paul's leg, Vardaman peers, his mouth full open and all color draining from his face into his mouth, as though he has by some means fleshed his own teeth in himself, sucking. He begins to move slowly backward from the bed, his eyes round, his pale face fading into the dust like a piece of paper pasted on a failing wall, and so out the door. Paul leans above the bed in the twilight, his humped silhouette partaking of that owl-like quality of a wry-feathered, disgruntled outrage, within which lurks a wisdom too profound or too inert for even thought. Darn them boys, he says. Jewel, I say, overhead the day drives level and gray, hiding the sun by a flight of gray spears. In the rain the mules smoke a little, splash yellow with mud, the off one clinging in sliding lunges to the side of the road above the ditch. The tilted lumber gleams dull yellow, water-soaked and heavy as lead, tilted at a steep angle into the ditch above the broken wheel. Above the shattered spokes and above Jewel's ankle, a runnel of yellow water, neither earth nor water swirls, curving with the yellow road, neither of earth nor water, down the hill, dissolving into a steaming mass of dark green, neither of earth nor sky. Jewel, I say. Cash comes to the door, carrying the saw. Paul stands beside the bed, humped, his arms dangling. He turns his head, his shabby profile, his chin collapsing slowly as he works the snuff against his gums. She's gone, Cash says. She's taken and left us, Paul says. Cash does not look at him. How nigh are you done, Paul says. Cash does not answer. He enters carrying the saw. I reckon you better get at it, Paul says. You'll have to do the best you can with them boys gone off that away. Cash looks down at her face. He is not listening to Paul at all. He does not approach the bed. He stops in the middle of the floor, the saw against his leg, his sweating arms powdered lightly with sawdust, his face composed. If you get in a tight, maybe some of them will get here tomorrow and help you, Paul says. Vernon could. Cash is not listening. He is looking down at her peaceful, rigid face fading into the dusk as though darkness were a precursor of the ultimate earth, until at last the face seems to float detached upon it, lightly as the reflection of a dead leaf. There's Christians enough to help you, Paul says. Cash is not listening. After a while he turns without looking at Paul and leaves the room. Then the saw begins to snore again. They will help us in our sorrow, Paul says. The sound of the saw is steady, competent, unhurried, stirring the dying light so that each stroke her face seems to wake a little into an expression of listening and of waiting. As though she were counting the strokes, Paul looks down at the face, at the black sprawl of Dewdale's hair, the outflung arms, the clutched fan now motionless on the fading quilt. I reckon you better get supper on, he says. Dewdale doesn't move. Get up now and put supper on, Paul says. We got to keep our strength up. I reckon Dr. Peabody's right hungry coming all this way, and Cash will need to eat quick and get back to work so he can finish it in time. Dewdale rises, heaving to her feet. She looks down at the face. It is like a casting of fading bronze upon the pillow. The hands alone still with any semblance of life, a curl, gnawed inertness, a spent yet alert quality from which weariness, exhaustion, travail has not yet departed. As though they doubted even yet the actuality of rest, guarding with haunted and penurious alertness the cessation which they know cannot last. Dewdale stoops and slides the quilt from beneath them and draws it up over them to the chin, smoothing it down, drawing it smooth. Then, without looking at Paul, she goes around the bed and leaves the room. She will go out where Peabody is, where she can stand in the twilight and look at his back with such an expression that, feeling her eyes and turning, he will say, I would not let it grieve me now. She was old and sick too, suffering more than we knew. She couldn't have got well. Vardaman's getting big now, and with you to take good care of them all, I would try not to let it grieve me. I expect you'd better go and get some supper ready. It don't have to be much, but they'll need to eat, and she looking at him saying, you could do so much for me if you just would, if you just knew. I am I, and you are you, and I know it, and you don't know it, and you could do so much for me if you just would. And if you just would, then I could tell you, and then nobody would have to know it except you and me and Doll.